Before we dive into one of the most brutal calculations of World War II, hit that subscribe button right now. This channel brings you the untold stories of history's greatest battles, the real decisions made in smoke-filled rooms where millions of lives hung in the balance. Don't miss out. Subscribe and turn on notifications because what you're about to hear will change how you see the final battle of the European war. April 1945. The Reich is dying, but it refuses to fall quietly. Soviet forces stand poised on the Oder River, 60 kilometers from Berlin, the heart of Nazi Germany. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the man who broke the siege of Leningrad, who turned the tide at Stalingrad, who drove the Wehrmacht back across 1,000 miles of blood-soaked earth, now faces his final and perhaps most costly mission. But before the first artillery shell screams across the Oder, before the first tank crashes through the streets of Hitler's capital, Zhukov sits in a secure room, surrounded by maps, intelligence reports, and the cold assessments of the Soviet General Staff. The question hanging in the air is not whether Berlin will fall. The question is how many Soviet soldiers will die taking it. The briefings that took place in the days leading up to the Berlin offensive were not merely military planning sessions. They were exercises in brutal arithmetic, calculations of acceptable losses measured against political imperatives. General Antonov, Chief of the General Staff, Marshal Vasilevsky, Chief Military Advisor to Stalin, Colonel General Voronov, the artillery genius who had orchestrated some of the war's most devastating barrages. These men knew the numbers, and the numbers were staggering. The intelligence summaries laid out before Zhukov painted a picture of formidable German defenses. The Wehrmacht and SS had transformed the approaches to Berlin into killing grounds. The Silo Heights, rising 30 to 40 meters above the Oder floodplain, provided the Germans with perfect observation and fields of fire. Soviet reconnaissance reported 3 defensive lines, each bristling with anti-tank guns, machine gun nests, and artillery positions registered to cover every avenue of approach. The Germans had flooded sections of the Oder Valley, creating marshes that would channel attacking forces into predetermined kill zones. They had laid thousands of mines, constructed concrete obstacles, and positioned their remaining armor in hull-down positions with interlocking fields of fire. The General Staff's estimates were sobering. Breaking through prepared defenses of this caliber would require overwhelming force and would inevitably result in heavy casualties. Historical analysis of previous Soviet offensive operations against fortified positions provided grim benchmarks. When the Red Army had assaulted similarly prepared German defenses at the Dnieper crossings in 1943, losses in the assault divisions had exceeded 30% in the first 72 hours. At the Vistula Oder operation earlier in 1945, despite achieving tactical surprise, Soviet forces had suffered approximately 200,000 casualties to cover the distance from Warsaw to the Oder. Now they faced an enemy fighting for its capital, for its very existence, with no retreat possible. The planners estimated that the initial crossing of the Oder and the assault on Silo Heights would likely cost between 15 and 20% casualties in the first echelon rifle divisions within the first 48 hours. For armored units attempting to exploit the breakthrough, the losses could be even steeper. German anti-tank defenses, including the deadly 80mm guns and the new Panzerfaust shoulder-fired weapons issued in large numbers to infantry, could destroy 30 to 40% of attacking tanks in the initial breakthrough phase. Zhukov absorbed these projections with the grim pragmatism of a commander who had spent 4 years watching soldiers die. But the military calculus was complicated by political imperatives that brooked no compromise. Stalin was obsessed with taking Berlin before the Western Allies. The race was not just against the Wehrmacht, but against Eisenhower's armies approaching from the west. Soviet intelligence reported that American and British forces had crossed the Elbe River and were within striking distance of the German capital. Stalin's paranoia about being shut out of the final victory, about losing political leverage in the post-war order, drove his demands for speed, regardless of cost. The Supreme Commander had made his position clear in conversations with his marshals. Berlin must fall to Soviet forces, and it must fall quickly. The political value of capturing Hitler's capital outweighed any calculation of military casualties. This pressure manifested in another dimension that colored every aspect of the planning: the rivalry between Zhukov and Marshal Konev. Stalin had deliberately positioned Konev's First Ukrainian Front to the south of Zhukov's First Belarusian Front, with orders to drive toward Berlin from the south. The boundary line between the two fronts extended only to Lublin, 60 kilometers southeast of Berlin, leaving the final approach ambiguous. Stalin's message was clear. Whoever reached Berlin first would claim the glory. This competition, while spurring both commanders to aggressive action, also meant that neither could afford to slow down, to consolidate, to minimize losses at the expense of tempo. The calculus shifted from optimizing military efficiency to maximizing speed, and speed in warfare always carries a blood price. The operational plan that emerged from these briefings reflected both Soviet strengths and the acceptance of heavy casualties as the cost of victory. Zhukov commanded a force of unprecedented firepower, over 2.5 million soldiers, more than 6,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, and most critically, over 41,000 artillery pieces and mortars. The artillery density along the main axis of attack would exceed 200 tubes per kilometer of front, a concentration never before achieved in military history. The plan called for a massive artillery preparation beginning in the pre-dawn darkness of April 16th. But this preparation would be preceded by a controversial tactical innovation, the use of searchlights. Zhukov had ordered the positioning of 143 anti-aircraft searchlights along the assault front. These powerful lights, each capable of throwing a beam visible for kilometers, would be switched on simultaneously at the moment of assault, their beams directed toward German positions to blind defenders and illuminate targets for advancing Soviet infantry and tanks. The General Staff's assessment of this tactic was cautiously optimistic, but acknowledged significant risks. Searchlights had never been used on this scale in ground combat. The hope was that the lights would disorient German defenders, destroy their night vision, and create psychological shock. The planners estimated this might reduce initial casualties by 5 to 10% if it achieved the desired effect. However, intelligence officers warned that the lights could also reveal Soviet positions, making advancing troops more vulnerable to defensive fire. The searchlights represented a calculated gamble, an attempt to gain tactical advantage through innovation, but the briefings made clear that even in the best case, they would not fundamentally alter the brutal nature of the assault to come. The plan for crossing the Oder and storming the Silo Heights involved intricate coordination of combat engineering, artillery, armor, and infantry that reflected hard-won Soviet experience in breakthrough operations. Engineer battalions would construct bridges and ferries under cover of darkness and artillery fire, racing against time to get armor across the river before German artillery could destroy the crossing points. The planners estimated that despite defensive fire and possible flooding by the Germans of remaining dry crossing sites, engineer units could achieve initial bridging within 4 to 6 hours of H-hour, but anticipated engineer casualties of 20 to 30% in the first wave. These specialists, working under direct fire to place pontoons and clear mines, would pay a particularly heavy price. The assault on Silo Heights itself would begin with the artillery barrage, a thunderous preparation lasting 30 minutes, designed to suppress German defenses and destroy obstacles. The briefings acknowledged that even this unprecedented concentration of firepower would not eliminate German defensive positions. Concrete bunkers and dug-in troops could survive all but direct hits. The infantry assault would have to clear positions the old-fashioned way, with grenades, flamethrowers, and close combat. First-echelon rifle divisions were warned to expect fierce resistance and significant casualties. The plan called for tank support to be committed immediately behind the leading infantry to provide mobile firepower, but everyone in the briefing room understood the risk. Channeled by terrain and obstacles into predictable routes, Soviet armor would face concentrated anti-tank fire. Historical experience suggested that up to 40% of tanks committed in the first assault waves might be disabled or destroyed within the first day. As the briefings progressed into discussions of the battle for Berlin itself, the casualty projections became even more sobering. Urban combat was the most costly form of warfare, a lesson the Soviets had learned in blood at Stalingrad, at Kiev, at every contested city across Europe. Berlin presented unique challenges. Intelligence estimated the city garrison at 300,000 German troops, including SS fanatics, Wehrmacht regulars, and Volkssturm militia. The Germans had fortified the city extensively, transforming buildings into strongpoints, streets into kill zones, and the subway system into a network of defensive positions. The civilian population, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, would further complicate operations, creating both humanitarian concerns and tactical obstacles. The General Staff outlined a methodical approach to urban combat that acknowledged the inevitability of high casualties, while attempting to minimize them through doctrine and preparation. Assault groups would be formed at the battalion and regiment level, each consisting of infantry, tank support, combat engineers with demolition charges and flamethrowers, and artillery observers with direct communication to supporting guns. These groups would advance block by block, building by building, reducing strongpoints systematically. The planners estimated that in dense urban terrain, Soviet forces would advance at a rate of 200 to 400 meters per day, with daily casualties in assault units potentially reaching 5 to 10%. For a campaign that might last 2 to 3 weeks, this meant combat units could expect casualties approaching or exceeding 50% before the city fell. Tank losses in urban combat were projected to be catastrophic. Armor operating in city streets without infantry support would be extremely vulnerable to Panzerfaust attacks from close range, from windows, from rubble. The briefings recommended that tanks operate in close coordination with infantry, never venturing into built-up areas without dismounted troops clearing adjacent buildings. Even with these precautions, the planners estimated that armored units might lose up to 60% of their vehicles in the Berlin fighting, with many disabled tanks recoverable, but requiring extensive repair. The mathematics were brutal, but unavoidable. Taking Berlin would cost tens of thousands of Soviet lives and hundreds of tanks, but the political imperative demanded acceptance of these losses. Throughout these briefings, one figure loomed over every discussion: Stalin himself. The Supreme Commander was not present in person, but his will pervaded every calculation. Stalin had made his expectations explicit in his orders and in his manipulation of the command structure. The allocation of resources reflected his priorities. Zhukov's first Belarusian front, attacking directly toward Berlin from the east, received the lion's share of artillery and armor. Konev's first Ukrainian front, approaching from the south, was tasked with encircling Berlin from the west and potentially driving into the city if Zhukov's assault stalled. Rokossovsky's second Belarusian front would secure the northern flank. This deployment ensured that Berlin would face overwhelming force from multiple directions, but it also guaranteed that the assault would proceed regardless of initial casualties. Stalin's impatience with casualties that might slow the advance was well known to his commanders. The dictator measured success in cities captured and kilometers gained, not in lives preserved. The briefings made clear that any commander who faltered, who prioritized force preservation over forward momentum, would face immediate relief and possibly worse. This created an operational environment where accepting heavy losses to maintain tempo was not just militarily expedable, but politically mandatory. Zhukov understood this calculus intimately. His success as a commander rested partly on his willingness to expend resources, human and material, to achieve objectives. He had demonstrated this at Stalingrad, at Kursk, in the great offensives of 1944. Now, approaching Berlin, he would do so again, knowing that the price would be measured in tens of thousands of Soviet lives. The final element of the briefings addressed the question that hung unspoken in the room: what would happen after the breakthrough, when Soviet forces closed in on the Reichstag, on Hitler's bunker, on the symbolic heart of Nazism? The planners acknowledged that this final phase would be the most costly. The SS and fanatical Nazi defenders would fight to the death in the government quarter. The Reichstag itself, a massive stone structure, would have to be taken room by room, floor by floor. Intelligence suggested that Hitler might be in his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, and capturing or killing him would require penetrating multiple layers of defenses. The briefings included estimates that the final assault on the government quarter might cost several thousand casualties over a period of days, with no guarantee that Hitler himself would be captured alive. But these losses, like all the others, were deemed acceptable in pursuit of total victory. As Zhukov listened to these projections, he faced a commander's eternal dilemma: how to balance mission accomplishment against the lives of his soldiers. But in April 1945, with Stalin's will driving the offensive and the prize of Berlin beckoning, the balance had already been struck. The mission was paramount, casualties were acceptable, and speed was essential. The briefings provided Zhukov with the information he needed to make tactical decisions, but the strategic decision, to attack regardless of cost, had been made at the highest levels of Soviet power. What the generals told Zhukov about losses was not a warning or a counsel of caution. It was simply data, numbers that quantified the expected price of victory, The assault began on April 16th at precisely 0300 hours. The searchlights blazed to life, their beams cutting through the darkness like the fingers of a luminous giant. For a moment, the psychological effect was devastating. German defenders, their eyes adjusted to darkness, were blinded by the sudden brilliant illumination, but the tactical advantage proved fleeting. Smoke, dust and debris from the artillery barrage quickly diffused the light, turning the battlefield into a chaotic twilight where neither side could see clearly. The searchlights, rather than illuminating targets for Soviet gunners, created confusing shadows and silhouettes that made coordination difficult. Within hours, some commanders ordered the lights turned off, realizing they caused as much confusion for their own troops as for the enemy. The artillery barrage was everything the planners had promised, overwhelming, devastating, and yet insufficient to break German resistance. For 30 minutes, over 40,000 guns hammered German positions, but when the barrage lifted and Soviet infantry surged forward, they discovered that many German positions had survived. Dug-in troops in concrete emplacements, artillery in revetments, anti-tank guns in camouflaged positions, these emerged from the smoke and dust to meet the Soviet assault with withering fire. The advance that was supposed to carry the heights in a single day bogged down in desperate fighting. Soviet casualties mounted rapidly as rifle divisions threw themselves against prepared positions. Tank units, committed to exploit the anticipated breakthrough, found themselves channeled into kill zones where German anti-tank guns destroyed vehicle after vehicle. The General Staff's projections of 15 to 20% casualties in the first 48 hours proved, if anything, conservative. Some assault divisions reported casualties exceeding 25% in the first day alone. The 8th Guards Army, attacking the Silo Heights directly, suffered over 10,000 casualties in the first 2 days of fighting. Tank losses were severe. The 1st and 2nd Guards tank armies, committed to exploitation, lost hundreds of tanks to mines, anti-tank guns and Panzerfausts. By April 17th, when Zhukov committed his armor reserves in a desperate attempt to break the deadlock, the blood price of the Silo Heights was becoming apparent. The heights finally fell on April 19th, but not through the swift breakthrough the planners had envisioned. It fell through sheer weight of numbers, through waves of assault troops that accepted staggering casualties to overwhelm defenders through attrition. The advance into Berlin brought no respite. As Soviet forces entered the outskirts of the city on April 21st, they encountered the urban warfare the briefings had predicted. Every building was a fortress, every street corner a potential death trap. German defenders, knowing they faced annihilation, fought with suicidal determination. The Soviets implemented their assault group tactics, but even methodical room-by-room clearing could not prevent heavy casualties. Soviet soldiers advancing through Berlin learned to fear cellars and upper floors equally. Both could harbor defenders with Panzerfausts or machine guns. Tanks moving through streets without adequate infantry support were systematically destroyed by close-range rocket fire from building windows. The daily casualty reports from units engaged in the Berlin fighting confirmed the General Staff's grim estimates. 5 to 10% daily losses were routine, and some battalions reported losses approaching 20% in a single day of intense fighting. The final assault on the Reichstag, beginning on April 30th, exemplified the cost of symbolic objectives. The building, heavily fortified and defended by SS troops and Volkssturm, was taken floor by floor in desperate fighting. Soviet assault troops used grenades, flamethrowers, and point-blank tank fire to reduce each defensive position. The famous photograph of the Soviet banner being raised over the Reichstag captured a moment of triumph, but it was a triumph purchased with hundreds of Soviet lives in the preceding hours of combat. By May 2nd, when the last significant German resistance in Berlin collapsed, the cost of the operation was staggering. The Berlin Strategic Offensive Operation, lasting from April 16th to May 8th, cost Soviet forces approximately 300,000 casualties, including over 80,000 killed. First Belarusian Front alone reported over 175,000 casualties. Tank losses exceeded 2,000 vehicles, though many were later recovered and repaired. When measured against the pre-assault briefings, these numbers told a complex story. The General Staff had correctly predicted the approximate scale of casualties, the concentration of losses in breakthrough operations, and the grinding attrition of urban combat. What they had underestimated was the sheer determination of German resistance, particularly at Silo Heights, where defenses proved more resilient than anticipated. The searchlights, touted as a tactical innovation, provided minimal advantage and may have actually increased confusion. The artillery preparation, while unprecedented in scale, could not substitute for close combat in reducing fortified positions. The briefings had prepared Zhukov and his commanders for a costly operation, but the reality proved even harsher than the estimates suggested. Yet from the Soviet perspective, the operation achieved its objectives. Berlin fell to the Red Army, not to the Western Allies. Stalin secured his political prize, his bargaining position for the post-war world. The Soviet flag flew over the Reichstag, a symbol of total victory over Nazi Germany. That this victory cost 300,000 casualties over 3 weeks was, in Stalin's calculation, an acceptable price. Zhukov and the other Soviet commanders had delivered what was demanded of them: rapid victory regardless of cost. The mathematics of the briefings, the cold projections of acceptable losses, had translated into reality with terrible precision. The human dimension of these numbers is almost impossible to grasp. Each casualty represented a Soviet soldier, a farmer from Ukraine, a factory worker from Moscow, a student from Leningrad, who had survived years of brutal warfare only to fall in the final battle. Many were veterans of the long march from Stalingrad or Kursk, men who had fought across 2,000 miles of devastated landscape, who deserved to survive to see the peace they had fought for, but instead died in the rubble of Berlin or on the slopes of Silo Heights. The General Staff briefings had quantified their lives as percentages and force ratios, as acceptable losses in pursuit of political objectives. This was the terrible logic of total war, where human beings became resources to be expended in calculated quantities. For Zhukov, who bore operational responsibility for the First Belarusian Front's assault, the Berlin operation represented both his greatest triumph and perhaps his greatest tragedy. He had delivered Stalin's victory, but at a cost that would haunt assessments of the operation for generations. Historians have debated whether a more cautious approach might have reduced casualties. Could Zhukov have waited for better intelligence on Silo's defenses? Could he have used more siege tactics and less frontal assault in Berlin itself? These questions acknowledge the terrible dilemma of wartime command, the tension between minimizing casualties and accomplishing the mission. In April 1945, with Stalin demanding speed and the Western Allies approaching Berlin, Zhukov had no real choice. The political imperative overrode military optimization. The casualties were not incidental to the operation. They were the price of the political objective. The briefings that preceded the Berlin offensive stand as a testament to Soviet military professionalism and the brutal arithmetic of modern warfare. The General Staff correctly assessed the scope of German defenses, accurately projected the approximate scale of casualties, and planned an operation that, despite heavy losses, achieved total victory. But they also reflected the moral calculus of Stalin's Soviet Union, where human life could be quantified and expended in pursuit of state objectives with cold pragmatism. The generals who briefed Zhukov were not monsters. They were professional officers, providing their commander with the information needed to make informed decisions. The monstrosity lay in the system that demanded victory at any price, that measured success in territory gained rather than lives preserved, that subordinated military logic to political imperatives. When the guns finally fell silent over Berlin on May 2, 1945, and the formal German surrender was signed on May 8, the Soviet victory was complete. Nazi Germany had been utterly destroyed, Hitler was dead, and the Red Army stood triumphant over the ruins of the Third Reich. The cost: 300,000 Soviet casualties in the Berlin operation alone, part of the staggering 27 million Soviet dead across the entire war, was deemed acceptable by those who made such calculations. For Stalin, for the Politburo, for the architects of Soviet strategy, Berlin was worth the price. Whether history judges that calculation as justified or as a war crime of reckless disregard for human life remains a subject of debate. What remains undeniable is that the briefings given to Zhukov in April 1945 laid bare the terrible truth of modern warfare. Victory often belongs to those willing to pay the highest price in blood, and in the spring of 1945, the Soviet Union was willing to pay whatever price was necessary to plant its flag over Berlin. The legacy of those briefings, of the projections and estimates that became grim reality, extends far beyond the tactical details of the Berlin operation. They represent a case study in the subordination of military considerations to political imperatives, in the acceptance of casualties as necessary costs rather than tragedies to be minimized. For students of military history, The Berlin offensive demonstrates both the effectiveness of overwhelming force and the terrible price of frontal assault against prepared defenses. For students of political history, it illustrates how great powers pursue symbolic objectives regardless of cost, how the race for post-war advantage can drive operational decisions with profound human consequences. And for anyone trying to understand the human dimension of World War II, it reminds us that behind every statistic, every casualty figure, every military briefing, were individual human beings whose lives were calculated, quantified, and ultimately sacrificed in pursuit of victory. The conversations that took place in those briefing rooms, the projections that generals presented to Zhukov, were not the sanitized discussions of strategy we might imagine. They were confrontations with brutal reality, acknowledgements that the path to Berlin led through a valley of death measured in tens of thousands of lives. The generals who presented these estimates knew what they were asking of Soviet soldiers. They knew that the projections would translate into telegrams to families, into hospitals filled with wounded, into mass graves in German soil. But they also knew that in April 1945, in Stalin's Soviet Union, in the final desperate push to end the most destructive war in human history, there was no alternative. The mission was given, the resources were allocated, and the cost would be paid. If you found this deep dive into the brutal calculations behind history's greatest battles compelling, you need to subscribe right now. We bring you these untold stories, these moments when great commanders faced impossible choices, these human dramas played out on the grandest and most terrible stage. Hit that subscribe button, smash the notification bell, and join us as we continue to explore the truth behind the battles that shaped our world. The next video is already in production, and you won't want to miss it. Subscribe now because history, this raw, this honest, this unflinching, demands to be heard.